So this has been one that's a little awkward to even talk about, and I'm just going to put that out there. But the board did set a new cap for board members' salaries, and it's generated a lot of interest on both sides of the issue. So we'll just put out of the way right now that it's a little awkward to talk about, but explain the discussion behind that.
You know, so one, it is awkward because, you know, having 5 people have a conversation that ultimately is going to affect what they earn from their job is admittedly awkward and it's bizarre. Unfortunately, as is the case with many things in the Commonwealth of Virginia, that's the law.
That's how it is.
That's the way it is. We're required as a board to determine our own salary cap. And interestingly enough, we can only do so once every 4 years, when our 5-member board has 40% of the seats up for re-election. So that is prescribed by state law. And that's the only way in which board salaries can be adjusted. There can't be a referendum or any other mechanism. The board has to do it and can only do it once every 4 years. It hadn't been done since 2011. And so if we didn't do anything this year, then the next opportunity wouldn't come until 2023. So we did have you know, a lengthy process, none of which was required, but we felt it was important to really talk about what the appropriate board salary should be. And so we did an action which set the cap. We then, based on economic condition and circumstances, will adjust board salaries in subsequent years as we determine the need.
Okay.
And we got a lot of, we got input, I think it was over 220 separate survey responses. We got some, of course, emails on the topic. But I think it's really important to emphasize that this is the cap and not the actual amount that we would in any given year appropriate or for salaries. And so that's a decision that would come later. But the cap piece of it, I really do think it's important for everyone to be able to serve, and we cannot have a county board where you're only able to serve if you are financially well off. That is not going to serve our community best. And from an equity standpoint, that's just critical to making sure that there are young families represented. Certainly, you know, think of a teacher or a firefighter, we would want them to be able to serve as well if they chose to in the midst of their career. So I think that cap point, and then the fairness of making sure that as we continue to grow as a county, 235,000 people by compared with when we started and when these caps began, we have a community that is well represented by everyone in that community.
And I think a lot of the questions people have is, on paper, the board is a part-time gig. I know, I've seen you guys around many, many hours that would go beyond what would be considered part-time. How much is really involved in terms of being a board member?
Well, that is one of those mythologies, that it's a part-time gig. That's not what the law requires. It actually, or states, you know, being an elected official has its own responsibilities. Some of them are statutory, things that we absolutely have to do. We can't delegate or walk away from, and those include not only the dozens of decisions that we make on a monthly basis at our board meeting, but it also includes serving on a number of regional authorities. These are not ceremonial positions. These are substantive positions to which we have you know, limited staff support. You know, it's something that we as board members substantively have to engage in. Those include Metro, serving on the Council of Governments, or the Northern Virginia Regional Commission, Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. I'm not giving you the exhaustive list. That's just an illustrative list. Then there are the many advisory groups that we all liaison with that are very much a part of connecting us to our community, which are things that we are not necessarily required to do, but I don't think I would ever want to see Arlington board members not do that. And then I haven't even touched on the engagement with our community and stakeholders. As we develop and grow, become larger, incorporate new lines of business that weren't apparent 20 years ago, there is a need to be accountable in so many different ways. Yeah, this is not a side gig.
Right.
And I think the stakes, if you just consider the stakes over the last 12 to 18 months on Metro. It is so critical we're well represented there, and it is, I think it was nearly an existential question that we get dedicated funding for Metro, and that takes persistence and focus on those big issues. This is not about always getting into the weeds, it's about being aware of the stakes in Metro. And if you think about our decision on Amazon, we did over 30, well over 30 community meetings, and I think that's fair that every part of our community wanted to understand that we were driving a smart bargain. And to do that well, that is some outreach that's critical. And then a third thing in the last 7 months, or 6 months, just as I've served on the board, is our budget. Getting those decisions right so that we get the resources for schools, but also are good fiscal stewards. Those are three big issues, and I think it's effectively a full-time job to do those big things well.
Okay, and so how does this then roll out? Your action this week set the cap.
It's at the cap.
But how does this then roll out?
So that cap will be effective January 1st, 2020. So that will be the maximum that board salaries can be. And just to get into the weeds a little bit, the cap was set at a level that matches the current individual area median income figure. So that's the point at which half of the metro area's region is earning less and half is earning more for an individual. So it's very much ensuring that we're not creating a cap that privileges the county board position from an income level, nor at the same time are we creating such a burden that we limit the pool of people who can serve. Future decisions about what the salary actually is will have to be made within the context of understanding what our fiscal position is, at least from my perspective. I'm not going to prioritize giving myself a dime more if it means that our community has to go without or has to sacrifice at a greater level. But to the extent that fiscal circumstances do allow it, this would be, to me, an appropriate step and would have an overall net fiscal impact on the county of around $200,000 annually if we went to the maximum of the cap.
And that's on a 1.4 or about 1.4, $1.5 billion budget. And so I think it's important to have that context. And if you're, no matter where your perspective is, if you have a perspective that has been a little more leaning towards the private sector, you want leaders who are going to be the best and brightest. And whether that's those of us who serve on the board now, you want, or whoever it is, think about what you really want. You want that talent, that extraordinary focus on doing the public's business well. If your perspective is a little more public sector, as with all the federal employees, there are issues at stake, and just I named some, but next is climate change and the community energy plan, which will be coming up, and we need to make sure that we do that right. And part of doing that right is having leaders who are representative and who are the best to serve.